Donc nous sommes en bas de la page 269. The examples of critical paternalism I have used so far are cases of surgical paternalism. Coercion is justified on the ground that the behavior implanted is good or the behavior excised is bad for people. Now consider a more sophisticated form of paternalism. Substitute paternalism justifies a prohibition by pointing not to the badness of what it prohibits, but to the positive value of the substitute lives it makes available. Suppose people in power think that a life of religious devotion is wasted and therefore prohibit religious orders. Citizens who might have spent their lives in orders will then lead other lives with other experiences and achievements they find valuable, even though, unless they change their convictions and endorse the paternalism, they will think these lives worse than the life they were denied. Someone who would have spent his life in monastic orders might, for example, take up a life in politics that is eminently successful and valuable to others in ways that he agrees make his life a better one. Now the dilemma we noticed earlier reappears. Suppose we agree that a life of religious devotion is wasted. The politician's life has plainly not been wasted. He cannot take credit, it is true, for the decision to give up devotion for politics, because that is not something he did or endorsed. But he can take credit for the various acts and decisions that made his life in politics a success. He chose that life and made those decisions with a sense of their value. How can we not think that the decent life he in fact led was better than the life he believed would have been worthless, whatever he thinks? But yet the oddness remains. How can the life he led be better when he goes to his grave thinking it has been worse? What? In what sense was a life more successful than left its son bitter, believing that he was leading a false, distorted life, at war with his own ethical sense? The model of challenge, though not the model of impact, has the resources to resolve this dilemma. If we accept the challenge model, we can insist on the priority of ethical integrity in any judgments we make about how good someone's life is. Someone has achieved ethical integrity, we may say, when he lives out of the conviction that his life, in its central features, is an appropriate one, that no other life he might live would be a plainly better response to the parameters of his ethical situation rightly judged. The priority of integrity makes a stronger claim that merely that disappointment and regret mar life, that these are features of a life that pro tanto make it worse. If that were all, then these negative components might easily be outweighed by the positive features of the substitute life. We would be comfortable saying that even though the politician would much have preferred a life in religious orders, his political career was nevertheless, on balance, even taking his own feelings into account, a better life than the wasted life he would have had. If we give priority to ethical integrity, we make the merger of life and conviction a parameter of ethical success, and we stipulate that a life that never achieves that kind of integrity cannot be critically better for someone to lead than a life that does. Of course, ethical integrity may fail for many reasons. It fails when people live mechanically, with no sense of having and responding to ethical convictions at all. It fails when people set their convictions aside and serve their volitional interests with a vague but persistent sense that they are not living as they should. It fails when people believe, rightly or wrongly, that the correct normative parameters have not been met for them, when they have fewer resources than justice permits, for example. And it fails conspicuously when people are made to live, but defiant of other people, in a way they regret and never endorse. So recognizing the priority of ethical integrity does not make ethics subjective in the first person, that is, for someone considering how he himself should live. Even in the first person, however, ethical integrity sometimes acquires an independent force. I cannot agonize over ethics all my life. I must come to terms, at least temporarily, with convictions that survive a decent and honest scrutiny. Then I treat these convictions no longer just as hypotheses about ethical value, but, right or wrong, as stipulating what ethical integrity requires of me. I claim a distinct virtue in holding to them for that reason. But there are limits to when and how far I can stand pat on earlier decisions in that way. For living out of conviction requires, if not continuing self-conscious reflection, at least taking seriously any doubts or twinges that might emerge, as well as the admonitions of teachers and friends. The role of ethical integrity is different in the third person. When I consider what life is best for someone else, I must take his settled convictions into account, just as facts, in my judgment about what kind of life he should lead. If my friend, after much self-examination, and after having opened his mind to arguments the other way, decides to enter religious orders, I can imagine his life then going 3 different ways. He might change his mind, perhaps after reflecting on further argument, and enter politics, successfully, for the good of the country, and with full satisfaction and confidence in the value of what he does and the wisdom of his choice. Or he might hold to his course and live a life of religious devotion, again with full satisfaction and confidence in his choice. Or he might for some reason bow to the advice of his friends and enter politics against his own instincts and convictions. He will be successful there, but will find no genuine satisfaction or self-approval, and will therefore never cease regretting his choice. I have no doubt that the first life is better, for him, than either of the other two. But I equally have no doubt that the second is better than the third, and that reflects my commitment to the priority of integrity in the third person. There is no skepticism in my ranking. I do not mean that the life of religious devotion is the best for him because he thinks it best. I have not changed my view that his life will be less successful than it might have been, and I will continue to argue with him if I think I can change his mind on that score. I mean that, given his unshaken convictions, it is the only life he can lead at peace with himself, and it is therefore the best he can do in meeting the challenge of his situation now understood to include that fact. Of course, some ethical convictions are so terrible or base that we would not encourage someone who was unable to shake them off to live at peace with them. But that is because a wicked life is bad for other people, not because we think a life against the grain would be better for him. If we accept the priority of ethical integrity, why are we concerned at all about how good a life other people lead, so long as they find it satisfying? Why should we try to persuade someone who finds value only in wealth and power to think again, if he has no doubt that his materialistic convictions are sound? The answer may lie simply in what seems a very abstract benevolence, that we believe people should lead better lives, find integrity at a higher level, even if the satisfaction they take in their new lives is no greater than that which they took in their lives before. The principle of priority offers no reason why we should not try to improve people's lives by persuasion and example in that way. But in most circumstances, the principle provides a more positive reason why benevolence should take that form. For we suspect that the materialist and the misanthrope will not in the end find their lives fulfilling or satisfactory. We suspect that their ethical sense will one day reveal their lives as barren and unrewarding, though perhaps tragically too late. We also know that integrity, over some range, is a matter of degree. Even if they think their lives successful now, and would continue to do so, we think they could unite life and conviction even more successfully with different convictions in place. But does the priority of integrity therefore recommend a deeper form of paternalism than those we have so far been considering? I have in mind cultural paternalism, the suggestion that people should be protected from choosing wasteful or bad lives. Ah, je comprends pas du tout ce que vous écrivez. The suggestion that people should be protected from choosing wasteful or bad lives, not by flat prohibitions of the criminal law, but by educational constraints and devices that remove bad options from people's view and imagination. People do not make decisions about how to live in a cultural vacuum. They respond in various ways to what their culture makes available by way of possibility and example and recommendation. Why then should we not try to make that cultural environment as sound as we can in the interests of people who will decide how to live influenced by it? Of course, our circumstances, including the ethical vocabulary and example of our culture, affect our ethical responses. But to some degree, these circumstances are up to us, collectively, and when they are, we must ask what these circumstances should be. We must ask, that is, What circumstances are appropriate for people who give value to their lives by showing skill in living? In the last section, we saw how justice becomes an ethical as well as political question in that way. We need normative parameters to define the challenge of living, and justice enters ethics when we ask how resources should figure in people's understanding of what that challenge is. Questions about critical paternalism enter ethics on the challenge model in a similar way. Those who defend cultural paternalism claim, in effect, that the circumstances appropriate for ethical reflection are those in which bad or wasted lives have been screened out collectively so that the decisions each individual is to make are from a deliberately restricted menu. If that were a sensible view of what ethical reflection should be like, then my argument that paternalism undermines ethical value because it destroys ethical integrity would be entirely misplaced. Living well would mean making the best choices from a culled list, and paternalism would be indispensable rather than threatening to ethical success. But that view is not sensible. A challenge cannot be more interesting, or in any other way a more valuable challenge to face, when it has been narrowed, simplified, and bowdlerized by others in advance, and that is as much true when we are ignorant of what they have done as when we are all too aware of it. Suppose someone replies that the challenge is more valuable when the chances of selecting a truly good life are improved, as they would be if the list of possibilities was filtered by wise collective rulers. That reply misunderstands the challenge model profoundly because it confuses parameters and limitations. It assumes that we have some standard of what a good life is that transcends the question of what circumstances are appropriate for people deciding how to live, and so can be used in answering that latter question by stipulating that the best circumstances are those most likely to produce the really correct answer. On the challenge view, living well is responding appropriately to circumstances rightly judged, and that means that the direction of argument must go in the other way. We must have some independent ground for thinking it is better for people to choose in ignorance of lives other people disapprove. We cannot, without begging the question, just argue that people will lead better lives if their choices are narrowed in that way. No, I don't understand anything. I speak French or English or Spanish, but I don't even know in what language you're writing. Once that point is grasped, any temptation toward cultural paternalism must disappear. That does not mean that government has no responsibility for the cultural background against which people decide how to live. A government anxious to provide the right circumstances for citizens choosing how to live might well strive that its community's culture provide opportunities for and examples of lives that have been thought good by reflective people in the past, and that might sensibly and properly be lived now, particularly if popular culture provides few examples of those lives. My arguments for government support of the arts in a matter of principle did not include that argument, because I was attempting there to reply to the objection that such support is unjust when the funds could be used to help relieve disease and unjustified poverty. But a state that has fulfilled the requirements of justice may properly use public funds to support art that the market will allow to perish, on the substantive ground that art improves the value of lives available in the community. The issue of paternalism, therefore, adds a new dimension to the differences between the impact and challenge models of ethical value. The impact model allows a defense of surgical paternalism because that model divorces ethical value from ethical choice. The challenge model fuses value and choice. It insists that nothing can improve the critical value of a life unless it is seen as an improvement by the person whose life it is, and that makes surgical paternalism self-defeating. It makes substitute paternalism self-defeating as well when the substitute life lacks ethical integrity. The challenge model undermines cultural paternalism, finally, because that form of paternalism assumes an independent, transcendent picture of ethical value, and the challenge model rejects any such picture. The model does not rule out the possibility that the community should collectively endorse and recommend ethical ideals not adequately supported by the culture, nor does it rule out compulsory education and other forms of regulation which experience shows that are likely to be endorsed in a genuine rather than manipulated way when these are sufficiently short-term and non-invasive and not subject to other independent objection. All this follows from the central constitutive role the model of challenge assigns to reflective or intuitive conviction. Ethical value is objective, but it has features, which we have now noticed, that tempt us to call it subjective as well. We do better, however, to resist that dangerous temptation and take care, instead, to expose the complex phenomenology of ethical judgment, particularly the differences between judging for ourselves and judging for others. 1. Ethics and community. Ethics and community. The last set of problems I described raises the question whether and how far ethics can be social rather than individual. Does ethical integration, the idea that someone's critical interests involve not only his own experiences and achievements but also those of groups to which he belongs, make sense? The impact model supposes that each person's critical good consists in the impact that he makes on the world. It can defend ethical integration only by arguing that an individual sometimes has a more valuable impact on his own when he thinks not of his own impact but of the impact of a group to which he belongs. Games theory and moral and political philosophy in its wake have defined one situation, the so-called prisoner's dilemma, in which this is true. In these situations, individuals, each acting rationally to advance his own interests, will together do what is worst for each, and this may be true not only when people aim at what is in their own interests in the narrow volitional sense, but when they aim to have an objectively valuable impact on the world. See Derek Parfit, Reasons and Persons. In these circumstances, each would do better to ask not how he could have the maximum impact, but how some group might, and then to do his part in that group's project. In that way, each secures a greater impact by what he himself does, and so he produces, according to the model of impact, a critically better life for himself. But the impact model cannot explain our actual convictions by appealing to the structure of a prisoner's dilemma, because the most common convictions or intuitions of ethical integration do not match that structure. We feel ethically integrated only into groups to which we already belong in some other way, and then only for acts of those groups that are already established in the group's practices as collective, only into those political communities of which we are citizens, and only for the acts of those communities, like their political decisions, that are institutionally collective. See Chapter 5. So we recognize ethical integration on many occasions when there appear, at least, to be no advantages to projects we favor in our doing so. I have no games theoretical reasons for thinking my life goes worse if my community does what I want it not to do. The collective rationality of a prisoner's dilemma solution cannot explain my personal shame at Vietnam. Moreover, we often have no sense of ethical integration when cooperation is plainly appropriate. Both my fellow prisoner and I have a strong reason to sign an enforceable agreement not to confess, and each of us may have a moral reason not to confess, even in the absence of such an agreement. But unless we are partners or friends or relatives or are acting together in some joint project, neither of us is likely to feel the reason of ethical integration. That his own life goes badly unless the group of the two of us prospers. So the order of explanation of any argument that the model of impact might offer for ethical integration would go the wrong way. Ethical integration sometimes provides the motivation needed for collective rationality, but not vice versa. The model of challenge puts ethical integration in an entirely different light. It need not show, in order to make sense of such integration, that an individual has more impact through a community's collective action than on his own. It need only show how ethical integration might sensibly seem an appropriate response to an important parameter of an individual's circumstances, the fact that he lives bound up with other people in a variety of communities. That is, in fact, a very widely shared view about living well, and so the challenge model is able to make sense of ethical integration in a natural rather than strained way. I should probably repeat once again that the challenge model is not a mechanism for supporting convictions like that one. What? I do not cite the abstract claim of that model. That the goodness of living well is a matter of performance, not of impact, as part of the case for ethical integration. I mean only to point out, for the final time in this long section, that interpreting the convictions we already have as convictions about a skillful response to a complex challenge gives them more sense and coherence than the alternate general interpretation that they are convictions about having the best impact can give them. 3. From ethics to politics. I said that I had two aims in this chapter. To study the question of metric in ethics. Can you read it? Ouais. Est-ce que je peux lire cette page? Ah, cette page. Je sais pas. C'est des pages comme ça. Ouais. Non, bah je fais juste le paragraphe. Does psychic mean mad? I'm French, I'm not English or American. Like I said that I had two aims in this chapter. To study the question of metric in ethics as important for its own sake, and to show that one response to that question, the model of challenge, provides an important reply to the arguments against liberalism that I began by reciting, I don't know. I turn now to the second of these aims. I shall assume, in what follows, that we have self-consciously embraced that ethical model of challenge and also embraced what I called an irresistible consequence of it, that justice is at least a soft parameter of a good life for us. I assume, as I shall put it, that we have become ethical as well as political liberals. I shall try to show that, on those assumptions, we have special reasons for adopting liberal equality as our political morality and rejecting its various rivals. And I will read the next later. This evening or tomorrow. And no, I'm not mad, if that is the question. I am a candidate at l'Agrégation of Philosophy in France, and this book is at the program of the second part. Why? Why would I have those abilities? No. I'm not a magician nor how do you say a voyante? No. I'm just a philosophy teacher and student. And this book is at the program of the second part of the contest. Philosophy teaching contest in France. So I have to read it, to translate it, to be able to comment it à l'oral. I don't know how you say this. It's not a written épreuve. How do you say épreuve in English? It's not a written. How do you say épreuve? I'll have to read it, translate it in French, and comment it in a speaking way, so written. Why would I have those abilities? Why did you ask me that question? No, but I'll have to go. I'll end the live. But I'm really sincerely interested in knowing why this question came up to your mind. Because my students already asked me this. But because I told them a story about me. And the moment I passed my philosophy épreuve, why did you thought I did? Just like that. Just because I look like someone who can read minds. Okay. No, you can't give me a reason? Well, I have to end up the live, so yes, I will continue probably tomorrow. I would like to continue this evening, but I'll be watching Kill Bill 2 with my mother, so I think I will be too tired to read the next. I was about to say good evening because in France it's evening, but maybe for you it's morning. Oh, my mother will go without me. University. I am already a philosophy teacher, and I prepare the contest of teaching philosophy in France, which are very difficult in France. They're called l'agrégation and CAPES. So it's college. Sorbonne University, maybe you know.